Today we're talking about stress, which many of us are obviously incredibly familiar with. I would argue probably all of us are familiar with stress. And what we're going to learn is that the human stress response, or this response that's wired into us as human beings via evolution and adaptation, is not something that's bad. It's allowed us to survive. It's important in helping us overcome stressors. It even boosts our immune system and helps us fight off disease. We're going to learn, however, when we experience chronic stress or when that stress kind of never goes away, when those stressors never go away, stress can actually be very, very bad for our body. So it's important for us to learn how to cope and manage it. What are some things that cause us stress? Kurt Lewin identified what we call intrapersonal conflicts, or conflicts where we have conflicting motives. And he says essentially that these are things that can bring on stress for us. So let's talk about these four types of conflicts. In an approach conflict, that's a conflict which might not seem super stressful because we're choosing between two attractive options. So I'm using the college process as an example here. I got into two really great schools, two that are at the top of my list. Which do I choose? This is an approach conflict. I like to think of it as we approach things that we like. So these are two options that we like, two attractive options. An avoidance conflict is the opposite. This is a conflict where we have to choose between two equally unattractive options. So I didn't get into any of my top schools, but only the ones at the bottom of my list. Again, how do I choose? But this time, there are two situations that I'd rather avoid. An approach avoidance conflict is a conflict in which there are both positive and negative aspects to the decision that needs to be made. So, for example, I go and I visit this really great school. I love the campus so much, but they really don't have a great program for my major. So there's positives and negatives. And then a multiple approach avoidance conflict, where we might experience the most degree of stress, is a conflict where we've got to make a choice and there are lots of positive and lots of negative aspects to it. So my dream school is super prestigious. I get a scholarship. The campus is beautiful, but it's far away. I'm not sure if I want to leave home. I need straight A's in order to maintain my scholarship. And I'm going to be playing a sport and I won't have a life outside of my homework. At least that's what I'm thinking at this point. So these are examples of situations that we all experience that can bring on the stress response. And I stress the fact that stress is a response and not a thing. Stress is the process of appraising and responding to a challenging or threatening situation. What do we mean by appraise? What does it mean to appraise something? To appraise something means to kind of measure its worth, measure its value. In this case, we're kind of sizing up the situation or the stressor and deciding the extent to which it's a threat and how much, and how we should deal with it. A stressor is a thing. It's a stressful stimulus, a condition that demands us to adapt. I think we often use stress when in fact we mean a stressor. I say, I'm like, my homework is so stressful. Your homework may be stress inducing, but the homework itself we would call a stressor. Here's an example of what I mean by appraisal. So I have a stressful event like a tough math test coming up. There are two different ways that I can appraise that stressful event. I can see it as a threat, like, oh my gosh, this is so beyond me, I can't do it, I'm going to fail. Or I could see it as a challenge. I've got to know how to apply everything that I know. I'm going to work until I get it. I'm going to meet with the teacher. I'm going to ask my friends for help. I'm going to watch some Khan Academy videos until I've got this and I can show it on the test. See how these two different appraisals of the same situation can lead to very different responses. It can lead us to be stressed to the point where we're distracted and we can't perform, we're over aroused, or we could be just aroused enough, just alert enough, and just focused enough, and we can really knock it out of the park. So I'd like you to think of an event that you have coming up, or maybe something that you're in the midst of experiencing right now. And I want you to fill out the little graphic organizer that's in your notebook. Think about the stressor, just like the math test on the previous slide, And think about two possible mindsets or appraisals. Think about two approaches that you can take to looking at that stressor. And then just complete the graphic organizer in your notebook. Think about what the possible outcomes would be depending on how you appraise it. The stress response is a psychophysical response or a mental and physical response. The physiological stress response involves the brain, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland. The autonomic nervous system, remember, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic, your fight or flight response, arouses the body, preps you to fight or to flee. Parasympathetic brings you back down. The endocrine system, sorry, I already mentioned the pituitary gland and the secretion of stress hormones. But the stress response also involves our subjective feelings. Think about our appraisal and the way that those different types of appraisals make us feel. They can make us feel sad and upset. It can make us excited and motivated. It includes a behavioral response, the fight or flight element. Do I flee and do I retreat from the challenge of this test, or do I face it head on and do I attack it? And then, like we were saying a few minutes ago, the cognitive appraisal element. And this is what accounts for individual differences. This is what accounts for differences in some of us being able to identify a threat and successfully figuring out how we're going to cope with it versus situations where, we're not able to properly assess the threat and we don't figure out how we're going to cope and we end up being flooded. So our goal is to figure out how we can appraise stress in a way that enables us to cope with it appropriately. The physical stress response, stepping away from the mental and into the physical for a minute, includes that initial arousal, the sympathetic nervous system, the increase in heart rate, increase in breathing, increase in blood pressure and perspiration. Acute stresses are temporary. Chronic stresses are prolonged. The arousal grows slowly. So think about emotions like jealousy, or chronic stress like that which we experience in school, for example, or in our relationships. This is chronic stress, and the stress response, because it's happening kind of slowly and gradually, can be very, very bad for the body. It includes a proactive behavioral reaction, so the fight or flight, which is controlled by our amygdala and our hypothalamus. It involves both the autonomic nervous system, like I was saying before, and the endocrine system, and it can lead, in some situations where we're experiencing chronic stress, to the immune system being compromised, which is the focus of our next lesson.